I wasn't in a good place that fall, and that's the plainest way to say it without dressing it up. I was 58. My hands were still black in the lines from years of diesel work no soap ever quite reached, and I had outlived my wife by 11 months and 6 days when I unlocked my father's old timber place in the Cascades and moved in for what I told people was a short reset. Men like me use words like reset when we mean collapse. I had burned down at the shop in a slow, practical way, missing easy steps, leaving tools where they didn't belong, standing over an open engine block and forgetting what I had already talked. Nobody fired me. That would have been cleaner. My foreman put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Take some time, Russ." And I nodded like we were talking about a fishing trip, instead of me not trusting myself around heavy equipment anymore. The homestead sat 5 miles up a forest road that turned to rutted clay whenever rain came through, and rain came through most days by late October. My father had logged selective stands there 40 years back, then kept the small place going with stubborn routines: split-rail fence, gravity-fed spring line, woodshed, 2-room cabin with a deep porch, and a stove that could still throw heat hard enough to dry gloves in an hour. I grew up swinging a maul there on weekends and cussing quietly when my dad corrected my stance. After he passed, my wife, Marlene, and I used to drive up twice a year, open all the windows, air out the dust, and pretend we were the kind of couple who retired early and took up birdwatching. She liked the ridge at dusk. She said the mountain light made even bad memories look gentler around the edges. After she died, I didn't come back once until that fall. I couldn't. Then I couldn't stand not coming either. Grief worked like that, at least for me. It made both choices feel wrong. My son, Eli, and I had already been drifting before the funeral, if I'm being honest. He lived 2 counties over, had his own family, his own work, and I had a bad habit of pretending silence was the same thing as strength. After Marlene was gone, he called every Sunday for a while. I answered, kept it practical, asked about weather and tires and whether his youngest still liked dinosaurs, then got off the phone before anything real could come up. By the 5th month, his calls got shorter. By the 8th, they got scarce. I told myself he needed space. The harder truth was that I had trained him not to reach too far into me. He finally stopped trying, and I called that respect when it was really resignation. Most mornings at the homestead started in the dark. I woke to the stove gone cold, pulled on stiff jeans and stepped into air that bit behind my eyes. I hauled 2 buckets from the spring box, 1 in each hand, boots slipping on wet needles where the path tilted. I checked the fence where elk had leaned on it. I banged ice out of the chicken water pan even after the chickens were long gone, just because the pan was there and my hands needed a task. I split wood until my shoulder burned, then switched sides and made the same bad swing my father used to scold. Blue, my old hound, followed me from station to station like a quiet foreman. He was 12 and mostly grey around the muzzle, with that patient look old dogs get when they've already forgiven you for things you haven't admitted yet. I fed him first every evening, always. That had become law in my house and every place that felt like one. By midday, I usually had grease under my nails again from tinkering with the old farm truck, even though I'd told myself I was taking a break from mechanical work. Habit was stronger than intention. I rebuilt the fuel line in the cold with 2 space heaters pointed at my hands, because I still knew how to fix what had clear tolerances and honest failure points. Human life didn't give you torque specs. Engines did. I trusted engines. I used to laugh at stories like this, the kind told in low voices on bar stools after the 2nd round, where somebody's cousins saw something in timber that didn't fit into daylight logic. I was the guy who asked for measurements and weather reports and whether there were tracks clear enough for castings. I believed in bearings, compression, and receipts. If a thing happened, it left marks in the world. If it left no marks, it was usually loneliness wearing a costume. Late afternoons were the worst stretch. Work was done or close enough, light drained early, and there was too much room between one task and the next. That was when the cabin felt largest and emptiest at the same time. I'd peel potatoes or warm beans, cut a heel of bread, and stand in the stove glow, listening to water click inside the pipes as the temperature dropped. Marlene used to hum while she cooked. I didn't notice how much space that humming filled until it was gone. Silence had weight after that. It sat at the table before I did. I ate on the porch when weather allowed, even in the cold, because smoke from the fire ring made the place smell lived in. One chipped enamel plate for me, one old coffee cup with a hairline crack, and beside it, every single night, a second enamel plate I laid out without thinking too hard. White with a blue rim, dented near one edge. It had been hers, then ours, then just there. I set it across from me by the fire like muscle memory had a religion, and I was still practicing it with no congregation. I didn't put food on that plate most nights. I just placed it square to the chair, same distance from the ring, like I was checking alignment on a drive shaft. If I skipped it, I slept worse. If I set it, I slept bad in a familiar way. That routine might sound theatrical written down, but it didn't feel that way, living it. It felt like sweeping a floor that would get dirty again by morning. Useful because it had to be done. By the second week of November, clouds sat low enough to swallow the ridge by mid-afternoon, and trips to town turned into strategy. You watched weather, checked chains, made lists so you didn't forget anything and waste fuel on a second run. The hardware store in Pine Hollow had one narrow aisle of groceries tucked between fasteners and plumbing parts. I bought beans, flour, coffee, lamp oil, and a new tarp for the woodpile because the old one had gone stiff and brittle at the corners. The clerk on duty that day was June Holloway, who had rung up half my life in one store or another and never needed to ask if I wanted a bag. "You settling in up there?" she asked while she scanned the lamp oil. "Settling's one word for it," I said. "Roads still passable, trucks running, blues eating better than I am." June gave me that sideways smile small-town people use when they're trying to offer kindness without making you carry the weight of it. "Mountains keep their own company," she said. "You holler if you need a plow pass. Lyle still does side runs when county falls behind." "I'll manage," I said, too quick. "I know you will," she said, and slid my receipt across. "Still, holler." That was the whole exchange, maybe half a minute, but it stayed with me driving back up through wet fir and alder. Not the words so much as the way she said them. Mountains keep their own company. It sounded like advice and warning in equal measure. Dark came early, and once it came, it held. I'd latch the shed, bank the stove, check the latch again, then sit outside with Blue for a little while, even when wind pushed cold through my coat seams. He liked to lean his shoulder against my boot and watch the tree line like he expected someone late for supper. I'd scratch behind his ears and pretend I was just airing out my head before bed. Some nights I talked out loud to nobody in particular, mostly practical things I had to remember in the morning. Drain the line, check the north fence brace, pull the battery if the cold deepened. Once in a while Marlene's name came out before I could stop it, quiet as breath smoke. The evening that fixed itself in my memory wasn't dramatic. No storm, no accident, no revelation. Just cold settling in layers. One clear star over the black cut of the ridge, and wood smoke drifting low across the yard. I heated venison stew from the freezer and cut cornbread from a cast iron pan I'd overbaked by 2 minutes. Blue ate, then circled twice and dropped beside the fire ring with a groan old dogs make when their joints argue with the ground. I carried my bowl out, sat down, and watched steam rise in the dark. Then, same as always, I stood back up, went inside, and came out with that second enamel plate. I set it opposite mine and lined it up by habit, edge parallel to the firing stones, a little absurd in my own eyes and still non-negotiable. My hands were shaking from the cold or from something else I wasn't naming. I remember looking at that empty plate and thinking, plain as a bolt on a bench, that I had built a life around not being a burden to anybody, and somewhere along the way I had mistaken that for not deserving company at all. That thought landed hard. Hard enough that I sat back down slowly, elbows on my knees, and let the night sound like nothing for a long minute. Blue lifted his head and looked toward the trees. I looked too, though I didn't know why, then laughed once under my breath at myself and at the whole stubborn shape of my life. I was a grown man in a worn canvas jacket, saying grace over beans with an empty plate set for a person who was gone, on a mountain that would freeze solid before Christmas. If that wasn't a kind of faith, I didn't have a better word for it. I ate in silence, fed the last crust to Blue, and sat with the fire until it burned down to coals the colour of old pennies. When I finally stood, I took my own plate inside to wash and left the second one out, where it was catching moonlight at the rim. I didn't do that as a signal. I did it because I couldn't bring myself to clear it away. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I stood there another moment with my hand on the porch rail, looking at that plate shining pale in the dark, and then I shut the cabin door behind me and listened to the latch click, like a decision I hadn't meant to make. Inside, the stove had settled to a low orange bed, steady and practical, the kind of heat you could trust if you fed it on time. I washed my bowl, wiped the table, set coffee grounds for morning. All the small end-of-day tasks that kept a man moving from one minute to the next. When I finally lay down, Blue circled twice on the rug and dropped with a grunt near the foot of the bed, but I stayed awake with my eyes open to the rafters and the old roof sounds I used to sleep through when Marlene was beside me. Limbs shifted in the wind, metal ticked as it cooled. Water moved somewhere in the line under the floor. My mind did what it had done every night for months, running old conversations on a loop and rewriting them too late. I thought about Eli at 14, sitting in my truck outside the parts store asking if I was coming to his game Saturday, and me saying I had overtime. I thought about Eli at 35, saying, "Dad, you don't have to do this by yourself." And me answering, "I'm fine," like it was a badge and not a warning label. Grief is one weight. Regret is another. Put both on your chest at 2 a.m, and even mountain air feels thin. Sometime after midnight, I got up, pulled on my coat over Long John's, and opened the door to throw one more split on the fire ring outside. I told myself it was to keep coals for morning ash. Truth was, I wanted to see if that second plate was still there. It was, right where I'd left it, rim wet with dew now, catching a little moonlight between clouds. Blue came to the threshold and leaned against my leg, warm and heavy, then looked past me toward the tree line with his ears half lifted. Not alarmed, just attentive, the way he watched the gravel road when he heard my truck years back. I scanned the dark out of habit and saw nothing but trunk shadows and the old fence line falling away toward the creek. "Nobody's coming, buddy," I said, and he gave one slow thump of his tail against the doorframe as if I had missed part of the conversation. I stood there longer than I meant to, then came inside, set the kettle for first light, and slept in scraps until dawn. Morning came grey and wet. Rain had moved in sometime near sunrise, the fine cold kind that soaked through denim without making much noise about it. I pulled on boots, stepped onto the porch, and saw the second plate still on the fire table where I'd left it, beaded with water, empty as expected. I took it in, dried it, and set it back on its hook by the stove. No ceremony, just routine. Blue waited by the door, patient and stiff in the hips, and we made the spring run with 2 buckets each. The path was slick with cedar needles pasted flat by rain, and halfway back my shoulder gave that sharp warning pinch that had started showing up every 3rd day. I set the buckets down, flexed my hand, cussed once, then finished the carry because there was nobody else to do it. By late morning, I'd patched a sagging hinge on the woodshed, checked the north fence post where frost heave had tilted it, and tried to split rounds I should have left for a better day. The maul glanced off one knot and jarred my arms to the teeth. I stood in mud up to my boot edges, breathing steam, and felt that old hollow settle in again, the one that said none of this was building toward anything. Keep the place up. Eat, sleep, repeat. Let winter narrow the world to chores and weather and the sound of your own boots. By the 3rd day after I left the plate out overnight, the rain had not quit long enough to dry kindling, and I was down to a milk crate of decent starts under the porch bench. That afternoon I walked to the edge of the lower stand with Blue, looking for deadfall that hadn't gone punky, and found mostly soaked limbs and bark sloughing off in my hands. The forest smelled rich and dark, cedar and wet earth and mushroom rot, and usually there'd be a racket of jays in that weather, squirrels arguing overhead, little movement everywhere if you stopped long enough to look. Instead it was quiet in a way I noticed before. I understood. I noticed it. Not empty, just held. No bird chatter, no sudden wing burst from brush, no nervous deer snort from the draw. Even the creek seemed to run softer under the rain. Blue stayed close to my knee, not tucked or anxious, just deliberate, and once he paused, lifted his head toward the thicker cedars west of the cabin and gave a low breath through his nose like he smelled something familiar. Then he moved on. I moved on too, because wet wood was still wet wood, and I had dinner to start. That evening I made beans with onion and salt pork, cornbread in the same iron pan, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon up. I set my plate. I set the second plate. Blue took his place by the fire ring and looked toward the trees again. One tail thump. Wait. Another thump maybe 10 seconds later. If I'd seen that once, I would have ignored it. But I'd seen it 3 nights running now, always when the second plate went down, never when I sat outside without it. I told myself he was tracking raccoon movement, maybe a deer path shift, maybe just old dog habit attached to my own. Dogs notice patterns and make them sacred. People do the same, then call it reason. I ate slowly, listening. The quiet was back, that same broad hush under the wind, and I had the odd feeling that the yard line between firelight and dark was occupied, not by threat, but by attention. I disliked that thought on principle. Attention implied intent. Intent implied a source. A source should leave tracks, droppings, broken brush, any plain sign a mechanic could point to and say, "There, that's your answer." I saw none of it. I slept better that night, which annoyed me. I woke before dawn to hard rain drumming the roof and figured I'd be down to newspaper twists and prayer to get the morning stove going. I shrugged on my coat, took the lantern, and stepped out toward the woodpile tarp, expecting a wet mess. The tarp had sagged in one corner from pooled water, just like I'd left it, but under the overhang by the shed door there was a neat stack of cedar kindling I had not cut. Dry, bone dry. Split fine, wrist thick, bark shaved clean on most of it, ends aligned like somebody cared about symmetry. Not a random toss, not wind-blown luck, not old leftovers I'd forgotten. Fresh scent hit me when I knelt. Sharp cedar oil, sweet and clean, the smell you only get from newly split heartwood. Rain tapped the tarp 6 inches away and never touched that stack. I crouched there with lantern light bouncing off wet mud and went through every possible explanation, because that is what I do when a thing won't fit. Maybe I'd cut it 2 days back and blanked on it. No, I hadn't swung a hatchet that fine in weeks. Maybe Lyle had come by and dropped some as a favour. Lyle stacked wood like a landslide and left boot prints you could map a county with. There were no boot prints. Maybe some old pile had shifted dry from deeper under the shed. No, these edges were bright and raw. No grey weathering. No spider silk between pieces. I looked at the roofline, at the fence, at the path from trees to shed. Rain had blurred everything into sheen and shadow. Blue came up behind me, sniffed once at the stack, then sat down and looked toward the cedars west of the yard, calm as Sunday morning. Tail thump, single, firm, then still. I said out loud, "Well, that's new," because saying anything bigger felt like stepping onto ice I hadn't tested. Then I did a ridiculous thing that still makes me grin when I think about it. I straightened up in my rain gear, lantern in one hand, and spoke toward the trees like a man addressing a neighbour over a fence. "Much obliged," I said. "If this is some prank, it's a practical one." My voice sounded small under the rain. Nobody answered, of course. I actually tipped my head once like I was at church, then caught myself and muttered, "Russell, you've gone polite to weather." Blue looked back at me with that old dog patience that says he has watched you do stranger things and plans to stick around anyway. I carried half the cedar in and got the stove lit in 5 minutes flat. The warmth pushed out fast, smelling faintly sweet from the new kindling, and I stood with both hands near the door, letting feeling come back into my fingers while I stared at those clean, split edges. A gift is too fancy a word for wood, but that morning it felt close. It felt like relief with grain lines. I should have been grateful and left it there. Instead, I was unsettled because gratitude needed an address, and I did not have one. By late afternoon, the rain broke to low cloud and a colourless light that made every fir trunk look inked in. I worked through the day on chores I could finish one-handed, mostly sorting salvageable rounds under cover and tightening the south gate wire. My shoulder barked every time I lifted above chest height. The mountain was quiet again. No jay squabble, no squirrel chatter. Just a few ravens high up, their wings making that slow paper sound when they crossed over the draw. Around dusk I took an apple from the crate by the sink and, without making a speech to myself about what it meant, set it square in the centre of the second enamel plate before I carried both plates out to the fire ring. "4 raccoons," I said to no one, as if labelling a thing made it ordinary. Blue settled by my boot, watched the trees, and gave one soft thump against the packed earth while the first stars came through the cloud breaks. 3 days passed with that same quiet pattern. My chores, the plate, Blue waiting. Before I admitted to myself I was no longer setting that second place out of habit alone. That admission sat with me so hard I left the fire ring untended until the beans cooled in my bowl. I watched Blue watch the trees and I kept trying to talk myself back down to ordinary causes. But the plain truth was I had become interested. Not spooked, not convinced, just interested in a way grief had not let me feel for months. Interest is a small thing until it isn't. It asks you to pay attention. It asks you to stay up a little later, to look twice at the same patch of ground, to remember where you set things. That night, after I brought my own plate in, I left the second one out again with the apple core and stem still in it, and I stood on the porch an extra minute, listening to the wet dark between the cedars. The next morning, the plate held 2 smooth riverstones, both thumb-sized, both pale grey, set side by side in the centre where the apple had been. No tooth marks, no peel scraps, No drag smears in the ash around the ring. Just 2 stones, clean enough to shine in dawn light. I picked one up and turned it over in my palm. It was cold and damp and real, like any rock you could pull from the creek bed, but I hadn't put it there. Blue sniffed the plate, then sat down and looked toward the same stand of trees west of the yard, calm as old furniture. I put the stone back exactly where I found it and said, "All right," to nobody in particular because that was the only honest response I had. I spent that day pretending I was above my own curiosity and failed at it by noon. I mended a brace on the north fence, cleaned the stovepipe elbow, and sorted canned goods by date, but every task bent back toward the same question. What takes food and leaves arrangement instead of mess? I walked the ring looking for raccoon prints and found none. I checked for deer tracks and found only soft, rain-softened depressions that could have been anything 2 days old. I told myself this was simple pattern hunger, a lonely man assigning meaning to coincidence. Then, I looked at those matched stones again on the table inside, where I had set them to dry, and the argument fell apart at the edges. Coincidence rarely bothers with symmetry. By the end of that week, I had turned supper into a quiet test without calling it that out loud. One night, I left half a square of cornbread on the second plate. In the morning, the bread was gone, and a small spray of raven feathers lay in a fan across the enamel, black with green sheen where the sun caught it. The following night, I left a pear from town that had gone soft near the stem. Dawn found the plate empty except for 2 crossed cedar twigs, trimmed clean, laid like careful hands had set them. On the 4th night, I put out nothing but the plate itself, and Dawn gave me a single bunch of wild asters, stems aligned, tied with a strip of grass. Late-season blooms, purple gone nearly grey with frost, yet fresh. I stood there in my long johns and boots, breath smoking in the cold, holding those flowers like they were a note I could read if I stared long enough. I ran the reasoning cycle again because that is my default setting. Could Lyle be playing a trick? Maybe once, maybe twice. But Lyle worked dawn to dark and drove an old diesel that announced itself from half a mile away. Could kids from town be hiking up? No recent boot prints on the road shoulder, no candy wrappers, no noise, and no kid I had met would spend this much effort on tidy gestures with no audience. Could a bear be nosing around? Bears do many things well. Arranging twigs in a centered cross on enamel is not one of them. I kept looking for the ordinary answer and kept finding care where chaos should have been. 3 evenings later, first frost silvered the yard before sunset, and the sky went that pale steel colour that means winter has started practicing. I set my plate, set the second plate, and added a polished stone I had kept from a river trip with Marlene years ago, flat and amber brown like old bottle glass. It had sat on our kitchen sill through 2 houses. I placed it there and felt silly at once, like I was trying to barter with weather. Blue settled at my feet, gave one soft tail thump, and watched the tree line. I watched him more than the trees. Dogs are better truth-tellers than men. If he had shown bristle, I would have changed course fast. He did not. He yawned, stretched, and laid his chin on his paws, pointed toward the dark, patient as a church usher. When I checked the plate at first light, my stone was gone, and in its place sat 2 new ones. One black, one amber brown, both flatter than mine, both lined up parallel to the rim. Not random, not dropped, chosen. I actually laughed then, short and quiet, because my life had narrowed to a conversation in objects with someone I had never seen, and somehow that felt less lonely than any phone call I had ducked that year. "You've started exchanging keepsakes with a stranger in the woods," I said to myself while I poured coffee. "That's either very wise or very dumb." Blue glanced up from his bed by the stove and thumped once as if voting for neither. The woods changed with my attention. I noticed where normal sounds stopped, where they resumed, how the creek carried farther on cold mornings. I noticed a faint scent some nights at the ring. Not rank, not musk-heavy like elk, more like wet bark and clean soil turned by a shovel. I noticed how often I felt watched, and how little that feeling resembled fear. It was closer to being measured for fit, as if something out there was deciding whether I belonged to the place or merely occupied it. That thought should have set my nerves jangling. Instead, it eased something in me I had not known was clenched. Grief had made me feel erased. Being observed, even from a distance, had the opposite effect. By the second week of December, a thin crust of snow had started holding in shadowed ground, and evening light dropped hard as soon as the sun slid behind the ridge. I was bringing in a final armload from the shed at Blue Hour when Blue stopped in the yard and raised his head. He did not bark, he did not growl. He stood still with one front paw lifted, ears forward, tail level, focused on the west cedar line. I set my wood down without a clatter and followed his gaze. At first, I saw only trunks and the narrow corridors between them, dusk painted in long bars. Then one of those dark verticals shifted against the others. It stepped out from shadow 40 yards off, and every measurement in me failed for a second before resetting. Tall beyond any man I knew, broad through chest and shoulders like two men side by side, covered in dark fur that held blue in the low light and brown, where the last sky glow touched it. He moved without hurry and without any wasted motion, carrying split logs in both hands as if they weighed no more than grocery bags. He walked to my chopping block, bent at the waist with deliberate care, and set each piece down one at a time, ends aligned to keep them from rolling. Not tossed, placed. Then he straightened, turned slightly so I could see the line of his face, and took 3 slow steps backward toward the trees, increasing distance instead of closing it. I did not feel hunted. That is the cleanest way I can put it. My heart was hammering, yes, and my mouth had gone dry, but the feeling in my chest was awe braided with disbelief, not panic. He stopped at the edge of shadow and stood there long enough for me to understand that stillness was intentional. Blue sat down beside me and, of all things, leaned against my leg, hard enough to shift my balance by an inch. Then he sighed. My old hound sighed like we were watching rain, not standing in twilight, with a being that rearranged my entire map of what lived in these mountains. I heard my own voice before I decided to use it. "Evening," I said, thin and hoarse. The figure did not move toward me, did not flare or posture, only held that quiet posture with his hands low and open at his sides. I took one cautious step toward the block, because my stubborn mechanic brain needed to verify the wood was real and not some trick of light. On the second step, my boot nearly landed in a print by the stump, deep and clear in the frosted mud, longer than my forearm from wrist to elbow. I checked myself, and, because dignity had left the premises by then, I murmured, "Excuse me," to a footprint like it might object to being stepped on. The absurdity of that hit me and almost made me laugh, a brief, shaky laugh that fogged in front of my face. I was a grown man with a bad shoulder apologizing to the ground while a giant stranger watched from the trees. Yet the moment held. No rush, no challenge, just presence. He shifted his weight once, slow enough I could track the movement through shoulders and hips, and I caught a clearer look at his eyes in the blue light. Amber brown, steady. Not flat like prey animals, not hard like a predator cornered. Steady, like someone listening carefully. I told myself this couldn't fit the world as I had kept it. I told myself I was exhausted, underfed, and 1 degree from seeing what I needed instead of what was there. Then the cold bit through my gloves. The logs sat stacked in front of me with fresh-cut faces. Blue's ribs moved against my knee in a calm, breathing rhythm, and those facts refused to bend. I wanted to run inside and bolt the door. I wanted to stay until dawn. I did neither. I stood where I was and let my hands shake until they stopped. After maybe 20 seconds, maybe a full minute, he inclined his head the smallest amount. Not a bow exactly, more an acknowledgement, then stepped backward into cedar shade and disappeared with less sound than a deer makes in dry grass. No branch snap, no dramatic crash, just dark, taking back dark. The yard returned in layers, wind in the eaves, my own breath, the soft tick of cooling metal from the lantern hook by the porch. Blue got to his feet, padded to the fresh stack, sniffed one log, and came back to sit at my boot again like his part in the evening had been completed. I walked to the block on unsteady legs and put my bare fingers on the top split. Cold, real, a little damp on the bark and dry along the fresh interior grain. I counted 12 pieces, all good burn wood, all cut to stove length, all arranged cleaner than I usually managed when my shoulder hurt. I looked toward the cedar line and saw nothing now but deepening blue and the first white points of stars above the ridge. "Thank you," I said, quiet but clear, and the words felt less like talking to the woods than returning one. That night, I cooked stew thicker than usual and set the second plate with a square of cornbread and one of the amber-brown stones beside it. I did not call it bait. I did not call it proof. I called it supper and sat down by the fire with Blue, pressed warm against my shin while snow began to feather down in the dark, soft and steady. And for the first time in a long while, my grief moved over enough to make room for wonder. Snow kept feathering down while I ate, and the flakes melted on my sleeve cuffs faster than they could gather. The fire gave off that steady popping heat that makes a man believe he can outlast a season if he keeps feeding it. And across from me the second enamel plate held cornbread and a different amber-coloured creek stone I'd found by the pump, close in colour to Marlene's but not hers, like a small, quiet promise. Blue stayed pressed against my shin until he lifted his head and looked west again. I followed his gaze and saw nothing at first. Then I saw shape instead of shadow, tall and still between two cedars, far enough back that the firelight barely found the edges. He wasn't hiding exactly. He was giving room. That landed harder than the first sighting had. Fear crowds you. Respect gives distance. I set my spoon down and held my hands open where he could see them, palms toward the flames. Same way I used to show a skittish horse I wasn't carrying a rope. "You can have the bread," I said, and my voice came out rough from cold and disbelief. "I've got plenty." He did not step forward. He watched, weight easy on both feet, head slightly tipped, as if sorting my tone more than my words. Blue thumped his tail once against the packed dirt and laid his chin back on my boot, completely at peace. If I had been alone, I might have convinced myself I was projecting calm onto a dark patch of timber. But dogs don't perform for your theories. They trust what they trust. In my head, the argument ran hot and practical anyway. This is fatigue. This is grief in a coat. This is your brain filling gaps because silence has gone on too long. Then he shifted one step sideways to keep a trunk between us when I leaned forward for the coffee pot, not out of panic, just careful repositioning, the way wary neighbours do when they don't yet know each other's habits. That single movement rewired something in me. I had been assuming I was the observed one, the tested one. Standing there with steam coming off his fur in the snow, he looked just as cautious about me. Not predator, not ghost, not legend. another living thing making decisions in real time. I laughed once under my breath at the absurd dignity of it all. I had become the kind of man who offered table manners to a giant in the trees. When my bowl was empty, I stood slowly, took my own plate inside, and left the second one where it was. I came back out with a log for the ring, and because old habits die hardest in front of new truths, I said, "Good night," toward the cedar line like we had done this 100 times. By then he had slipped back beyond the trunks, silent as falling ash. Blue and I stayed by the coals until the wind picked up and drove us in. I slept in fits, but each time I woke I expected dread and found something lighter. Not joy exactly, more like my chest had been unlatched one notch. At first light, the cornbread was gone. The amber-coloured creekstone remained, and beside it sat a twist of dried grass, braided into a loop around 2 tiny fir sprigs. Neat enough I had to pinch it between my fingers to believe it was real. No crumbs scattered, no muddy smears, no random mess. I set that little braid on the windowsill above the sink, next to the paired river stones, and the crossed twigs, and the frostbit asters already drying in a mason jar. By the third morning after that, a line had formed there like a language I didn't speak yet but had started to recognize, by rhythm. Give, receive, wait, notice. 3 days passed with that same pattern, and the mountains settled deeper into cold. I worked through shoulder pain that flared when I lifted rounds above waist height, cussed at frozen latches, and kept my truck battery on trickle between errands because night lows had dropped into the teens. In town for lamp oil and dog kibble, I ran into Lyle Madsen by the feed pallets. He was all wool cap and sawdust beard, carrying chain links over one shoulder like they weighed nothing. "You look like Winter already won an argument with you," he said. "Winter's up on points," I told him. He jerked his chin toward my cart. "June says you've been buying extra flour. Company coming?" "Not the kind you'd believe," Lyle snorted. "You sure it ain't a logger stacking that wood for you?" "Loggers don't leave wildflowers," I said. He looked at me for a long second, waiting for the punchline. When none came, he shifted the chain on his shoulder and said softer, "Mountains are old, Russ. Don't bother 'em and they generally return the favour." Then he added, back in his usual tone, "If your road drifts in, call me before you play hero with that shoulder." "I'll call," I said, and meant it. On the drive home, I kept hearing my own answer out loud in the cab. Loggers don't leave wildflowers. I had said it like fact, not speculation, and once spoken, it settled into me as plain truth. That evening I set out stew for myself, and on the second plate I placed a warm heel of bread and half a cooked carrot, because Blue liked carrots and had started giving me offended looks when I forgot his share. He sniffed the second plate, then sat facing the trees with that solemn patience of his, ears loose, breathing slow. While we ate, an old mule deer doe came to the edge of the lower clearing and grazed on exposed grass between snow patches. 50 yards upslope, I caught the dark, upright silhouette again. The doe never bolted. She lifted her head once, chewed and kept feeding. That image stayed with me long after dark. Prey animal calm, dog calm. Woods quiet, but not empty. By the second week of January, the freeze tightened hard enough to split a hose bib at the shed and turn the creek margin into thick glass. Everything took longer. The shoulder gave me trouble pulling the maul, and I started rationing motions the way you ration dry tinder. One afternoon, Blue wandered farther than usual along the lower fence, nose to ground where deer crossed near the old logging spur. I followed with a coil of wire and fence pliers, meaning to patch a sag I had been putting off. The snow crust held for 6 steps, then broke under my right boot and pitched me knee-deep in powder over hidden brush. Blue trotted ahead, then yelped once, sharp and startled, not hurt bad but wrong enough to spike my pulse. I dropped the wire and pushed through alder shoots to the sound. He had stepped into an old cable snare set low in the brush, probably poacher trash from years back, rusted but still spring-tight enough to cinch above his front paw. He was on his side, twisting, eyes wide, and every movement tightened the loop. "Easy, boy, easy," I said, hitting my knees in the snow. My fingers went numb almost at once. I tried to get the pliers on the crimp, but my shoulder lit up, and the angle was bad. Blue trusted me, but pain made him jerk whenever metal touched cable. I got one strand to fray and then lost grip. He whined soft and high, and that sound went through me worse than any winter wind. I remember the next seconds with painful clarity, snow falling fine as flour, my breath loud inside my hood, Blue's paw trembling under my glove. And then a shadow crossed us, not fast, not crashing, just present. I looked up, and he was there 10 feet away, enormous in the white light, hands open, posture low as if approaching a frightened colt. Every muscle in me wanted to guard my dog, and every signal in front of me said I didn't need to. He crouched at an angle that kept his body from crowding either of us, waiting until Blue's eyes found him. Blue stopped struggling, just stopped, like a switch had been turned from panic to attention. I slid back half a foot without thinking, making room. "Help him," I heard myself say, and I was crying by then from strain and cold and the helplessness I had carried since Marlene died, all of it rising at once. He reached in with fingers thick as shovel handles and moved with astonishing delicacy, pinching the cable above the lock to take tension off the paw while his other hand steadied Blue's leg. No jerking, no forceful yank. He examined the mechanism, then twisted the rusted latch with a controlled pressure that popped it open clean. The loop sprang loose. Blue pulled free and scrambled behind me, then immediately leaned against my back, shaking, but safe. He didn't touch the dog again. He gathered the broken snare cable, coiled it once, and set it on a stump beside my dropped pliers as if evidence mattered. Then he rose to full height, turned his head toward me, and held still. Up close his eyes were the same amber brown I had seen at dusk, steady and deeply calm. Snow had dusted his shoulders and melted in dark tracks along his fur. I put one hand on Blue and one hand on the stump to keep from tipping over and managed, "Thank you. Thank you." My voice cracked on both words. He gave the smallest nod, stepped backward through the alder gap, and was gone in 3 long, quiet strides that barely shook the brush. No drama, no triumphant moment. Just the sudden absence of a presence that had been gentle exactly where it needed to be. I sat in the snow until my jeans soaked through, checking Blue's paw over and over. Skin rubbed raw, no deep cut, no break. I wrapped it with my bandana and carried him the first stretch uphill even though my shoulder protested every step. He's a heavy old hound when he decides to go limp from shock. And halfway home I laughed through tears, because if anyone had filmed me, it would have looked like a stubborn man trying to carry a wet rug uphill while apologizing to it. At the porch, I cleaned Blue's paw with warm water, rubbed salve in, and laid him by the stove on the thick quilt Marlene used to keep for guests. He slept hard, belly rising steady, one ear flicking now and then at stove pops. I made coffee with shaking hands and set the broken snare cable on the table where I could see it. Physical proof. Rust flakes on my palm. Fresh bend where impossible strength had worked a frozen latch without harming what was caught. That evening, with twilight turning the yard blue again, I carried both enamel plates out to the fire ring. Mine held stew. The second held a strip of venison, 2 carrot coins and a clean rag folded square. Blue limped to my chair, settled against my boot, and watched the cedars with quiet trust. "I don't know what to call you," I said into the cold, "but you're welcome here." The woods stayed still. The fire burned steady. Blue slept, and for the first time since I had come up that mountain, I believed company might be something a man could receive as well as lose. The words had barely left my mouth when Blue lifted his head from my boot and gave a soft chuff toward the cedars. Not warning, not excitement, just recognition. I kept my hands around my bowl to steady them and watched the edge of the yard where firelight gave up to dark. Snow hissed against the coals. Somewhere up the slope a limb unloaded and dropped powder in a single, muffled rush. Then I heard the careful footfall I had started to know, weight placed heel to toe through crust instead of crashing through brush, and he came into view between two trunks with that same deliberate pace, broad shoulders dusted white, steam lifting faint from him in the cold. He stopped well short of the ring, maybe 20 feet back, where the light touched his chest but left his face mostly in shadow. Blue's tail thumped twice, slow and certain. Then he rested his chin again on my boot like this was now part of supper. I stared at the second plate and then back at him, and for a few seconds my mind refused to decide whether I was relieved or terrified or simply overwhelmed by a thing I could not file into any drawer I trusted. "You're really here," I said, and the sentence sounded almost foolish once it was out because, of course, he was. The snow, the tracks, the split cedar, the freed snare, all of it had been here. Still, saying it seemed to bridge something in me. He shifted his weight and lowered one hand toward the ground, opening his fingers slowly. In his palm lay a small bundle of green, winter fern and cedar tips tied with grass. He bent, placed it beside the second enamel plate instead of on it, and straightened again, giving room the whole time as if he understood boundaries better than most men I had worked with. The gesture was so careful it broke through my defenses faster than anything dramatic could have. Kindness has a way of bypassing argument. I had spent months, maybe years if I'm honest, gripping myself shut so hard I could barely breathe around it. Out there by the ring, with Blue warm against my leg and this enormous quiet being standing in plain sight, that grip started to fail. I tried one last practical thought. I need to eat while it's hot. I need to get inside. I need to stay sensible. And it slid right off me like sleet off tin. I set the bowl down and leaned forward with my elbows on my knees. "I don't know what I'm doing," I said toward the fire, toward him, toward Marlene, toward whatever listened. "I don't know how to do this part." He did not move closer. He did not retreat. He simply stayed, and that steadiness felt like permission. The first tear hit my glove and disappeared in the wool. Then another. Then my chest folded in on itself and I was crying in big, ugly, middle-aged gasps I would have fought to hide from anyone else on earth. Not polite grief, not composed remembrance, the raw kind that comes from holding too much, too long. Blue pushed up from the ground and leaned his shoulder hard into my shin, bracing me the way he did when my shoulder flared on steep ground. I put a hand on his neck and cried harder. "I miss her," I said, voice breaking. "I miss Marlene every hour, and I got mad at everyone for not carrying it right. I got mad at Eli for not saying the right thing, but I never told him what right even was. I shut him out and called it strength. I hid up here and called it work. I wiped my face with the back of my wrist and laughed once through it, a rough little sound. "You're getting quite a sermon for a guest who never asked for one." That made me grin in spite of myself because there I was, talking through tears to a giant in the snow while my old hound listened like a deacon. If somebody had told me this would be my winter, I would have checked their medication. The grin vanished as fast as it came. "I kept setting that plate because I didn't know what else to do," I said. "At first it was for her, Then it was for habit, then maybe for punishment. Maybe I thought if I kept one place empty long enough, I'd pay off whatever debt I owed for still being here. My breath shook and clouded in front of me. I don't want to do that anymore. He tilted his head slightly, eyes catching firelight now and then as the flames shifted. Amber brown. Steady. I had seen men pretend to listen while waiting for their turn to speak. This wasn't that. This was witness. Quiet and complete. I let words come the way they came, without cleaning them up first. I spoke to Marlene out loud, which I had only done in fragments before. I told her I still slept on one side of the bed by reflex, even in that little cabin. I told her I had kept her coffee cup in the back of the cabinet because seeing it first thing in the morning felt like being hit with a hammer. I told her I was tired of pretending I was managing when I was only enduring. Then I spoke Eli's name into the cold and had to stop to breathe around it. I should have answered different, I said. Every Sunday, every single Sunday. I should have let him in when he knocked. Snow thickened, soft and constant, gathering on the shoulders of my coat, frosting blues back. The fire settled lower, red heart under white ash. By the time the church bell in Pine Hollow would have marked 9, if sound travelled that far through weather, I had emptied most of what I had kept sealed since the funeral. Some of it was coherent, some not. I apologized to people not present. I confessed small, stubborn failures that had seemed trivial and somehow weren't. Through all of it, he remained where he was, calm and patient, never pressing, never turning away. At one point, I pulled Marlene's wedding band from my jacket pocket, the one I carried on bad nights when my own hand felt too bare, and held it out in my palm toward the flames. I don't know what to do with this either, I whispered. Feels wrong in a drawer. Feels wrong on a chain. Feels wrong everywhere and nowhere. My hand shook badly enough that the ring slipped and dropped to the packed dirt near my boot with a small, dull tick. I swore under my breath and reached down, but stiff fingers and low light made me clumsy. Before I could fumble farther, he moved one step forward, slow enough for me to track each shift, and crouched outside the ringstones. He waited until I looked up. I nodded without meaning to. He reached with 2 fingers, picked up the band as gently as if it were a moth wing, and set it on the fire table beside my bowl, not handing it to me directly, not crossing the invisible line we had both kept. Then he withdrew that hand and sat back on his heels. That small act undid me all over again. Not because of magic, because of manners, because of care. I pressed both palms against my eyes until the shaking eased. Thank you, I said again, hoarse and simple. For Blue, for the wood, for all of it. When I finally lowered my hands, my breathing had slowed. The hard knot under my ribs had loosened to a deep, clean ache, the kind that comes after setting a dislocated thing back where it belongs. Nothing outside had changed. Marlene was still gone. Eli was still far away. Winter was still winter. Yet I could feel that something in me had moved from clenched survival toward honest living, and that shift was not trivial. He rose in one smooth motion, towering again above the ring, and looked past me toward the porch, as if checking the cabin, the stacked wood, the path edge. Then he brought his gaze back to mine and held it for a long beat. No drama, no claim, just recognition. I'll call him, I said, surprising myself by saying it out loud. Not tonight, but soon. I'll call Eli and I won't hide behind a weather talk. Blue exhaled and rolled onto his side, belly half up toward the coals, trusting enough to sleep in the open with both of us there. That sight sealed it more than anything else. He stepped back once, then again, always facing us, his feet finding silent placement in snow that squeaked under my boots when I moved and made almost nothing under his. At the edge of firelight he paused, reached down, and touched two stones lying near the ring, one dark, one pale, turning them into a crossed pair before straightening. Then he inclined his head the same small way I had seen before, and he was gone. Not vanished, not theatrical. He simply walked into the cedar line and let distance and shadow take him piece by piece until there was only snow and trunks and the faint trace of movement that might have been wind if I hadn't watched it happen. I stayed where I was, listening to the forest settle back into its ordinary winter sounds. A far creek under ice, the hush of falling snow, Blue's slow breathing beside my boot. I did not chase him. I did not call after him. The moment asked for stillness, so I gave it. After a while, I stood, knees stiff, and banked the fire with the last of the split cedar he had brought. I picked up Marlene's ring from the table and slid it back into my pocket. Not hidden this time, just kept. I carried my own plate to the porch, then turned back for the second one. On it sat the fern and cedar bundle he had placed, and, now, the crossed stones from the ring arranged at the centre. I looked around the yard once more and saw no figure, only a line of deep prints leading west before snowfall softened their edges. Inside, I toweled Blue dry, checked his paw wrap, and fed him the carrot coins I had saved. He took them with grave dignity, then sneezed on my pant leg for balance. I made fresh coffee even though it was late, sat at the table with the ring in front of me, and wrote 3 things on the back of an old parts invoice so I couldn't wriggle out of them tomorrow. Call Eli. Oil saw chain. Pack snare cable for ranger station. Physical evidence stayed honest if you labelled it. Near midnight, I stepped out one last time with the lantern hooded low. Snow had eased to a fine dust. His tracks were still visible beyond the ring, each print wide as a serving platter, heel deep, toes clear in the drift. I knelt and measured one against my forearm from elbow to wrist, the same old mechanic reflex demanding scale. Real, measurable, present. I set the lantern down, took a cedar shake from the woodbox, and marked the spot beside the nearest print so I could find it at first light, before weather erased detail. Then I covered the second plate with an upturned pan to keep new snow off the stones and fern bundle. Back in bed, Blue curled close enough that his warmth reached my calf through the blanket. The cabin creaked and settled around us. I replayed the night, without forcing it into explanation. The prevailing logic I had lived by, if it's real, it's predictable. If it's not predictable, dismiss it, felt too narrow now, not wrong, but incomplete. Evidence still mattered. So did what could be witnessed in a human chest when kindness arrived without demand. I slept in one unbroken stretch for the first time since coming up the mountain. At dawn, I carried the snare cable to the table by the door, coiled and tagged for town, and when I opened the porch, the yard looked washed and new under a clean layer of snow. The print marker stood where I had planted it. The trail into the cedars had drifted over. The second plate waited under its pan, dry, with the crossed stones and green bundle exactly where they'd been left. He had withdrawn the way he had always moved through my life there, quietly, without ceremony, leaving only enough behind to keep me honest. By full light, I carried the lantern back to the marked print with a tape measure, my phone, and an old framing square from Dad's bench, because if I was going to keep faith with what I'd seen, I needed more than memory. The snow had crusted just enough overnight to hold the edges. I knelt, set the square at the heel, stretched the tape to the longest toe mark, and read out the number twice under my breath before I wrote it on the back of that same parts invoice. Then I took 6 photos from different angles, one with my boot beside it for scale, one with the cedar shake marker visible, one with the fire ring in the background so I could place it later, By the time I finished, light snow had started again, and I watched the ridges soften in real time. I didn't try to cast it. The ground was too cold and too damp, and I knew the mix would fail. I stood there with my knees aching and said, documented, like I was closing a work order, then went back to the porch and set the photos to back up on the cabin's weak satellite link while the weather still allowed it. Inside, I laid everything out on the table and gave each piece a place. The paired river stones, the crossed twigs, raven feathers, dried asters, grass braid, winter fern bundle, and crossed stones from that night, all went into shallow canning lids so they wouldn't scatter. I wrote dates where I had them and approximate where I didn't, because pretending precision where you don't have it is just another kind of lie. Marlene's ring I put in a small tin by the stove, not hidden at the back anymore. The broken snare cable stayed coiled in a feed sack by the door, with a tag that read, Lower Fence Spur, January 14th. Blue watched all of this from his quilt, paw wrapped clean and dry, eyes half closed but tracking me every time I moved toward the second plate. When I set that plate on its hook after breakfast, he gave one satisfied thump and went back to sleep. 3 days later, the road opened enough for a careful run to Pine Hollow, and I drove down with chains still on the rear tires, the snare cable, and more nerves than I expected. The ranger substation sat behind the county shed in a low cinder block building that smelled like wet wool and burnt coffee. A young tech at the front desk looked up from paperwork when I set the feed sack down. Need to report old trap hardware, I said. Snare. Caught my dog. We got him out. She called a district ranger from the back, a broad-shouldered woman named Marta Keene, with a pen tucked behind one ear. She emptied the sack onto a rubber mat, turned the cable in her hands, and nodded once. That lock style's older, she said. Could have been set years back and forgotten. Could have been reset by somebody trespassing. Either way, good you brought it in. I flagged the spot on my map, I said, sliding over a photocopy with coordinates from my phone. There may be more along that spur. She tapped the map, then met my eyes. We'll sweep it. If we find additional gear, we remove and log it. You'll get a call either way. I'd appreciate that. Her expression softened when she glanced at Blue's wrapped paw in the truck outside the window. How's your hound? Stubborn and hungry, I said. So, improving. On my way out, June caught me near the hardware aisle and gave me that same sideways look she always did when she had a question she might not ask. You all right up there? She said. I am, I told her, and this time it came out steady. Road's rough, but I'm all right. She held my gaze for a beat longer, then nodded. Good, keep being all right. She never pressed for details, and she never did, not once after that. That silence turned out to be a kindness of its own. I made the call to Eli that evening before I could invent another reason to delay. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone on speaker, Marlene's tin in front of me and Blue asleep under my chair. The line rang 4 times. Hey, Dad. His voice was careful, not cold, careful. I felt every year between us in that one word. Hey, kid, I said, though he was long past kid. You got a minute? A pause. Yeah, I do. I looked at my hands and decided not to perform strength anymore. I owe you a straight answer for a lot of Sundays. I wasn't fine. I said I was because I didn't know how to say the other thing. I've been lonely and mean about it, and that's on me. You kept reaching, and I kept handing you weather reports. On the line, I heard him breathe in, then out slow. I didn't know what you wanted from me, he said. I kept trying different versions. I know. I made it harder than it had to be. My throat tightened, but I stayed with it. I'm asking if you'd come up. Supper here, 2 places set. He gave a sound that was halfway to a laugh and halfway to something rougher. 2 places, huh? Yeah. Then I'm coming this Saturday. I'll drive up after lunch if the pass stays clear. I swallowed hard. I'll call Lyle for a plough pass on the last mile. Dad? Yeah? Thanks for calling me for real. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet for a long minute, then got up and wrote Saturday. Chili, cornbread, extra wood, on the chalkboard by the sink. Blue woke, stretched, and limped to the door for his evening round. Outside, I set my plate and the second plate by the fire ring, then added a third chair from the shed and left it folded against the porch wall, ready. By the third week of January, Marta called back just after dawn, exactly as promised. We swept your marked spur and 2 adjacent game trails, she said. Found 3 additional old snares and 1 rusted foothold trap. All removed, logged and bagged. No fresh sets on follow-up. I closed my eyes and leaned on the counter. Thank you. She hesitated, then added, You did good reporting it. Most folks toss hardware and move on. After that call, I took the feed sack tags from my pocket, wrote removed by district on each, and tucked them into Dad's old ledger. Evidence accounted for. Task closed. Saturday came clear and sharp, sky bright as hammered tin. Lyle ran his blade up my road around noon, diesel rumble echoing off the trees. He stepped down from the cab while I paid him in cash, and 2 jars of pickles. Company day? He asked, glancing at the swept yard and extra chair by the ring. My son's coming. He gave me a long look, not prying, just measuring the change the way men our age do when we don't have language for it. Good, he said. About time this place heard more than one voice. He climbed back in, then leaned out the window before pulling off. My granddad used to set an extra cup by the stove in hard winters, said the mountain notices hospitality. He tipped 2 fingers to his cap. Never told that to many people. Figured you might have use for it. That was all he offered, and all I needed. Eli's truck rolled in just before 4, tires crunching, his shoulders filling the doorway in a way that startled me with how familiar it felt. We stood there awkward for half a second, then he stepped forward and hugged me hard enough to make my bad shoulder complain. I hugged him back anyway. Inside, he noticed the windowsill display while the chili simmered. Dad, he said quietly, picking up one canning lid and setting it down again with care. What am I looking at? Things that were left, I said, and one thing returned. I told him the story at the fire after supper, plain and complete, with pauses where I needed them. I showed him the photos of the print and the measurement note. I showed him where the snare had been on the map and Marta's callback number in my recent log. I told him what I knew, what I guessed, and what I did not try to explain. He listened without interrupting, elbows on his knees, eyes on the coals. When I finished, he sat back and rubbed his jaw. I don't know what category to put that in, he said. Me neither. He looked toward Blue, who had rolled half on his back by the ring, paw healed enough to kick in a dream. But I know that dog. If Blue wasn't scared, that matters. It does, he nodded slowly. And I know you. You don't decorate a story. We sat in easy quiet after that, the kind I had denied us for too long. Before bed, he took Marlene's ring tin in both hands, looked at me for permission, and I nodded. He opened it, smiled with wet eyes, and said, Mum would have liked this fire tonight. He closed the lid and put it back where he found it. By early March, we had fallen into a rhythm that felt earned. Eli came up one weekend a month, sometimes alone, sometimes with a cooler and a long list of repairs he insisted on helping with. We fixed the porch step, replaced the split hose bib, and rebuilt half the woodshed wall before spring thaw. Every visit, I set an extra place at the fire, not as bait, not as a test, as thanks. Some nights the second plate stayed empty except for moonlight. Some mornings it held a paired stone or a small braid of grass, left neat as a signature. Some weeks, nothing at all. I stopped needing frequency to believe what had happened. I kept the windowsill collection in plain sight, labelled and dusted. I sent copies of the print photos and notes to Eli, and printed one for the cabin wall above Dad's ledger. Not to prove anything to skeptics, just to stay honest with myself. June kept ringing up my flour and lamp oil without questions. Lyle never raised the subject again, though once while loading fence staples into my truck, he gave the tree line a respectful nod and changed the subject to weather. The mountain did what mountains do. Snow melted, creeks swelled, jays came back loud and argumentative. The unusual stillness that had first caught my attention visited now and then at dusk, and when it did, Blue would lift his head, thump once, and rest easy. I would sit by the fire with Eli across from me and let that hush settle without reaching to name it. I still missed Marlene every day. That did not lift. It changed shape. The ache no longer told me I should withdraw from the living to honor the dead. It told me love had weight, and carrying it with open hands was better than hiding under it. I told Eli things I had kept locked for years. He told me when I slipped back into silence. We argued sometimes, ordinary father-son arguments about chainsaw safety and whether chili needed beans, and then we laughed and ate anyway. I cannot explain the one who came from the Cedars. I can tell you what he did. He met loneliness with presence, pain with patience, and a winter built to narrow my world with gestures that widened it. He never asked for anything, never crossed the line of respect, never made me smaller to make his mystery larger. He sat where I had kept a place empty for 4 years and turned that emptiness into company. I still set that second enamel plate every night the weather allows. Sometimes there are only coals, dog breath, and stars. Sometimes there is a crossed pair of stones waiting by morning. Either way, I am no longer a man hiding from his own life. I am a man at a fire, with room made ready, grateful for what arrived when I finally admitted I needed it.